Activision Blizzard's reputation has been in the dumpster for a while now, even beyond its over-prioritization on pre-existing IP like Call of Duty, how Blizzard reneged on the promise of Overwatch 2 PvE modes, and the obscene monetization in titles like Diablo Immortal. Activision Blizzard's reputation took its biggest hit when the state of California sued the company back in 2021. At the heart of the lawsuit was an accusation that Activision Blizzard had a toxic workplace culture and prominent sexual harassment. The lawsuit, as well as multiple reports from various journalistic outlets both inside and outside the game industry that released following the lawsuit, detailed numerous allegations like frat house cube crawls, women of color being passed over for promotions in favor of less experienced white folks, a woman who was demoted for reporting harassment, one person who was harassed to such an intense degree that they killed themselves, and one Blizzard higher-up who was so notorious for his sexual harassment that his office was nicknamed the Cosby Suite, which, yes, it's referring to that Cosby, because in 2021, subtlety was dead. And then there were critiques against Activision Blizzard CEO Bobby Kotick himself. In fact, the Wall Street Journal released a report, which was paywalled, so I'm just going off the information via the Verge, accusing Activision Blizzard CEO Bobby Kotick of knowing about, ignoring, and in some cases perpetrating harassment of his employees, one even being about a 2006 voicemail where Kotick threatened to have an assistant killed, something that an Activision spokesperson said that he had apologized for, and also claimed that that statement was hyperbolic and exaggerated, but still, that doesn't make Kotick's statement any less appalling. I mean, come on, hyperbolic or not, he verbally did threaten to have someone killed. And with that issue and all the others, you'd think that Activision Blizzard and Bobby Kotick would take this whole situation with the utmost sincerity and thus strive to change the company's horrible culture. You'd think they'd take that shit seriously. Unfortunately, Bobby Kotick is in denial. In a recent interview with Variety, Kotick defended Activision Blizzard's working environment by stating that the company had its own investigations into its own actions, and he criticized unions and labor for fanning the flames. Per the interview, we've had every possible form of investigation done, and we did not have a systemic issue with harassment. Ever. We didn't have any of what were mischaracterizations reported in the media, but what we did have was a very aggressive labor movement working hard to try and destabilize the company." End quote. Now, I find this gaslighting to be kind of offensive. After all, there is documented evidence of Activision Blizzard's toxic working environment. Because to be clear, if there wasn't evidence of misconduct, the state of California wouldn't have had grounds to sue the company. If there was not evidence, many Activision Blizzard high-ups, including Blizzard President J. Allen Brack, wouldn't have had to resign in disgrace. If there wasn't evidence of Bobby Kotick threatening on voicemail to have someone killed, he wouldn't have needed to apologize and settle the matter out of court. And if there wasn't evidence of higher-up mismanagement at Activision Blizzard, 1,000 employees wouldn't have felt the need to sign a petition demanding Kotick's resignation. Because to be clear, when it comes to Activision Blizzard, there are ample skeletons in this closet, Bobby. You don't even have to look that hard. While Kotick claims that Activision Blizzard has a low percentage of harassment complaints for a big company that employs over 17,000 people, and Activision Blizzard has recently revealed a transparency report detailing that in 2022, there were only 116 total investigated complaints, with a mere total of 31 complaints out of those 116 being substantiated, there are three problems here. First, these numbers occurred in the year following the reveal of Activision Blizzard's toxic workplace environment, i.e. after a few of the big offenders had already left or been fired from the company, either immediately following the reports of Activision Blizzard's misconduct going public or years prior. Secondly, as noted by The Verge, the transparency report only detailed the total number of cases that Activision Blizzard investigated, but did not detail the total amount of complaints they received, which, is kinda suspicious. And thirdly, the court of law and regulators have a different opinion of Activision Blizzard's past misdeeds and have criticized its internal sexual harassment reporting structures, a reporting system that the company was fined $35 million for by the SEC just this year. And then there's the fact that Activision Blizzard settled its suit with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for $18 million. Both things that make Activision Blizzard seem guilty, because paying fines and settling a lawsuit against themselves isn't something a company innocent of wrongdoing would do, because if they were innocent, they would be able to prove that shit. And between all of these problems, it's clear that Activision Blizzard can't reliably be counted upon when it comes to detailing its own issues with harassment and misconduct. They just are not trustworthy here. Another element of Kotick's statement about how an aggressive labor movement is working hard to try and destabilize Activision Blizzard that is troubling isn't how it comes at a time time when some smaller departments within Activision Blizzard's employ have begun to unionize. In fact, just last year, QA workers at Raven Software and the QA department at Blizzard Albany, which are both companies under Activision Blizzard's employ, voted to unionize. And prior to unionization efforts, these workers were put through the ringer. After all, QA jobs are often viewed as a lower tier of developer even in the best of times. And the QA workers at Raven Software were no different, because reportedly they were among the lowest paid workers at Raven Software, often weren't offered full-time positions, and were expected to crunch. And to make matters worse, they could be fired without much consideration despite all the work that they had put in, which are just horrible working conditions that cause Raven Software's QA department to decide to unionize, with Blizzard Albany's QA department following their lead. Decisions that, unfortunately, Activision Blizzard has and had been fighting tooth and nail with union-busting tactics like withholding raises from unionizing workers. The company tried to illegally survey and shut down internal chat channels in order to prevent workers from unionizing, and Activision Blizzard repeatedly did not recognize many of these unions. Also, the company could stretch this process out as long as possible. And for these actions, per a report on The Verge, the company has received many unfair labor complaints against it, many of which the National Labor Relations Board believes to have merit. And while sure, some of these complaints were rescinded, including one about that earlier mentioned illegal surveillance, these complaints were only taken back by the union only after Activision Blizzard had to be pressured in order to rectify those said complaints. And thus, the company tried to stall efforts that would have allowed workers to unionize. The company wanted to prevent workers from being protected from that said company's exploitative environment. And truly, let's be honest here, Activision Blizzard is a company that is known to exploit its workers. The company reportedly has a lower pay range when compared to its competitors. Developers often crunch hard and do overtime, and then there are instances where many workers whose job security are in limbo for months at a time, all before being unceremoniously laid off, all while Kotick and the rest of the executives boast of having record revenue. If anything, there are actual documented reasons to have unions at Activision Blizzard, even beyond the QA departments. They are a company that acts in bad faith, even before discussing the company's reported hotbed of sexual harassment. Activision Blizzard just has a lot of internal problems that it has no desire to correct unless done so when their hand is forced. Hence why union discussions have started to pop up at the company. And while sure, unions, though overall good, can have problems in how it can take a long time to negotiate a contract, and in how unions can still have internal communications issues, unions are still the best protections that workers can have from an avaricious and callous company like Activision Blizzard. Because truly, Activision Blizzard, sure as shit, doesn't really care about its employees beyond the profits that the company can extract from them. It's a company with a lot of documented and identifiable problems. And ultimately, to get back on topic, Kotick blaming Activision Blizzard's PR nightmare on an aggressive labor movement trying to quote-unquote destabilize the company is just distasteful. And Beth Allen, the communications director of the Communications Workers Alliance, i.e. the union that represents the QA department at Raven Software, agrees. Per a Beth Allen statement that was posted by Variety, corporations choose to be disruptive when they run anti-union campaigns. Workers who join together to improve their workplace intend to make constructive changes for the benefit of all. When employers voluntarily recognize unions and engage in good faith contract bargaining, it builds trust and strengthens companies. End quote. In other words, maybe instead of demonizing unions, maybe Bobby Kotick should blame Bobby Kotick for Bobby Kotick's problems. Just take some personal accountability here, Bobby. However, with that being said, Bobby Kotick himself wants you to know that he is not inherently anti-union. In fact, he knows that there are instances where unions are good. After all, his mother was in a teachers union, and Kotick himself is a part of the Screen Actors Guild due to how he was in the film Moneyball, which, quick aside, is a great movie. Per the Variety piece, I am not like other CEOs that are anti-union. I'm the only Fortune 500 CEO who is a member of a union. If we have employees who want a union to represent them, and they believe that the union is going to be able to provide them with opportunities and enhancements to their work experience, I'm all for it. I have a mother who was a teacher. I have no aversion to a union. What I do have an aversion to is a union that does not play by the rules. End quote. However, there is a problem that contradicts Kotick's claim that he supports unions. unions. See, the examples that he gave about unions he supported, like the teachers union his mother was in and the union SAG, which he is personally a part of, are unions that personally benefited him or a family member. But when stating that he is against a quote-unquote union that does not play by the rules, it honestly feels like he was referring to the unions forming at Activision Blizzard. After all, he accused a labor environment of trying to destabilize the company, and Activision Blizzard has responded to that labor environment by deploying many union-busting tactics to try and undermine those said unions, meaning that he is most likely against the unions forming at his company, even despite his flowery language that he espouses about supporting his employees who desire to be part of a union. There is just a dissonance here between the words he is espousing and his company's actions here, and that's even before discussing the hypocrisy of him claiming that the unions he benefited from are justified, all while acting against the unions at his own company. This is because, as the CEO of Activision Blizzard, he is inherently biased against the unions at his company, because obviously, and that's a worldview that he shares with movie studio higher-ups who are biased against the Screen Actors Guild, a union that Kotick is a part of, a union that just recently went on strike due to how movie studios were trying to cut actors a raw deal. And that's a bias that's similar to Kotick's disdain toward unions at his own company. Unions representing workers who have been mistreated, exploited, and underpaid at Activision Blizzard under the stewardship of Kotick, i.e. the person most responsible for the company that mistreats, exploits, and underpays those aforementioned employees. And the fact that some departments at Activision Blizzard have started to unionize in order to protect themselves from Activision Blizzard's executives and management is firstly on him. Yet Kotick won't see it that way because as a CEO, he is biased against workers and unions at his company. If he wasn't, Activision Blizzard wouldn't be deploying union-busting tactics in several instances here. If anything, the company's actions go against Kotick's statement about supporting workers who wanted to join a union. He just sees the unions at his company as obstacles that don't play by the rules, whereas in actuality, the unions representing Raven Software, as well as Blizzard Albany, are trying to represent employees who have been poorly mistreated by the company, and is trying to give those aforementioned employees the best deal possible. You know, which is what a union is supposed to do. So to conclude, Bobby Kotick's statements about how sexual harassment allegations at Activision Blizzard are overblown and should be blamed on a labor environment trying to destabilize the company are complete bullshit. The stats that Kotick believes helps disprove Activision Blizzard's past abuse have asterisks against it. Activision Blizzard employees, whether in a union or not, endure enough mismanagement and are taken for granted enough to warrant unionization, and despite Kotick claiming to be for unions in some scenarios, the union-busting tactics that Activision Blizzard has and is acting on undercuts that statement. And honestly, all of this forms one cohesive message, and that message is that Activision Blizzard and Bobby Kotick cannot be trusted to tell the truth on these things. They have proven to be an unreliable source over and over again. If anything, they espouse a narrative that casts labor and unions as the villain in order to obfuscate the fact that the real antagonist to Activision Blizzard's workforce comes from the very top. The real culprit of Activision Blizzard's woes is Kotick, management higher-ups, and Activision Blizzard itself. It's the company with the problem, not the workers. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you thought of this video and Activision Blizzard and Bobby Kotick's statement. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you under this credit sequence, and $5 a month allows you to make requests for movies that I can watch and talk about on the Riley and Friends podcast. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high-tier ones in Samantha Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.